So, after two great presentations of Tim and Peter, we're starting our first panel today. And the first speaker is Martina and Gwen, whom Peter has mentioned already twice. Martina comes here from New York, Baruch College, and she truly wrote a dazzling dissertation and on colonial modernism in Vietnam. And in 2020, you can read it in a book published by University of Hawaii Press. So please welcome with me Martina, and you have 15 minutes.
Thanks, Olga. Actually, Olga had a hand in the publication of the book since she very generously reviewed it, refereed it for University of Hawaii Press. But before I begin, I wanted to thank Thuong for the invitation to share my work with you today. I also wanted to thank Holly for doing all the logistical work and getting me here, and thank you to the university for this fantastic opportunity. So I will be speaking today about the self-reliant literary group, colonial republicanism and the politics of the center-left. This is a chapter in my forthcoming book, Untitled Chapter, and as Olga mentioned, it's forthcoming fall 2020 with University of Hawaii Press. And as time is limited and that the chapter has already been circulated, I am just going to crystallize the salient points of the chapter and focus mainly on the chapter's historiographical contributions. Oh no. Sorry? What? Oh no, I've got no pictures. Oh well. Well, if you could see the pictures, you would see that these are the 7 members of the Lugbendoan. But that's it. The Lugbendoan really needs no introduction, and I don't want to go too much into it, as almost every educated Vietnamese have either read their work or at least know of them. But I do want to sort of highlight a couple of important things about them that will frame my talk for today. The Lugbendoan was arguably the most important group of intellectuals in interwar Vietnam. It was made up of 7 members. The leader and founder was Nhất Linh Nguyễn Tường Tam, and today, this morning, I had the honor of meeting back Nguyễn Tường Thiết, who is Nhất Ling's son. And of course, he was joined in the venture by 3 of his brothers, Nguyễn Tường Lân, also known as Thạch Lam, Nguyễn Tường Long, known as Hoàng Đạo. Actually, most of the political writings in Phong Hoa Ngày Nay that I will be examining today basically is written by Hoàng Đạo, who was the sort of chief theoretician, the sort of political theorist of the group. But actually, also, we will be looking at the writings of Trần Khánh Dư, also known as Khai Hưng, who has the reputation of being the most romantic and the most prolific novelist of the group. But at the same time, in this period that I'm talking about in the political writings of the group, he was also writing quite prolifically on politics. So when we talk about the politics of the group, it mainly focuses on the writing of these 2 authors. And of course, the bottom row is, the group's poets. Hồ Trọng Hiếu, Tú Mỡ, Nguyễn Thư Lễ, Thế Lữ, and Ngô Xuân Diệu. The group's newspapers were the highest circulating newspapers in all of Indochina, and their novels and poetry were instant bestsellers. The group is overwhelmingly celebrated for their literary accomplishments. And the group had an important role in the creation of modern Vietnamese literature. Lots of scholarship on how they modernized the novel. Even though they weren't the first to write new poetry, they pioneered the new poetry movement. Their work is widely read, and it's a mainstay on university and high school curricula today. And of course, the nature of this literature, as it has been written in scholarship ad nauseum, the group championed individualism, romantic love, fought against the oppression of family. For example, Nyitling's most celebrated novel, Doat Duet, or Severance of Ties, the main character, Miss Luan, rebels after being oppressed by her mother-in-law. However, this focus on the group's literature has obscured, for the most part, the group's political vision, which will be the topic of my talk for today. And the group was the sort of vanguard of Vietnamese literature and intellectual life in the 1930s, but they were also political activists in their own right. And this period of the 1930s were crucial, formative years for Vietnamese nationalism and politics. And it was a time where Vietnamese intellectuals, such as the Self-Reliant Literary Group, forged political relationships and created identities that was going to define the revolution to come. Now, I'm actually not going to, move on to my next slide because there's no pictures anyway. But if you could see the pictures, it would be a picture of Pham Hoa and Nai Nai, the group's two main publications. So what I want to do now is just to highlight a number of historiographical issues that this chapter and then the book in general will be engaging with. As I mentioned before, the scholarship on the group overwhelmingly focuses on the group's literary writings, right? Lots of literary criticism about the group's poetry, prose, short stories, things like that. And for the most part, scholarship has overlooked, ignored, or neglected the group's journalistic writings. For a long time, the group's journalism, the group Pham Hoa Nai Nai were kept under, restricted access, and and their newspapers were not necessarily widely available until fairly recently, when Bác Nguyen Trọng Hiền and then Phạm Thảo Nguyên, who was the daughter-in-law of Thanh Lữ, basically brought Pham Hoa and Nai Nai to the wider Vietnamese public. So for the most part, scholarship has pretty much ignored the group's journalistic writings, and this is where the group's political writings were. As a result of this, the group in the scholarship has been framed as literary writers and less as broad-based intellectuals, and this has political implications. And this is the genesis of the label of the group. This focus on literature gives rise to the characterization of the group as bourgeois romantics, right? That their literature is a part of literary romanticism. Especially with their emphasis on individual freedom, romantic love, the fight against the family. But this also gives rise to a stereotype of the group as being apolitical and cultural, right? That they were cultural reformers and social reformers and not sort of political activists in their own right. And this is a criticism that's made by Marxist scholars over the years, that the group was not sufficiently revolutionary or anti-colonial in nature. And of course, this criticism begins kind of with Chum Ching's 1948 Marxism in Vietnamese culture, and of course, Marxist scholars through the decades have echoed this party line in a number in scholarship of the group. And of course, these characterizations are also unwittingly replicated by Western language scholars. So this chapter, as part of a larger thrust of my book, moves away from these Cold War interpretations and reinterprets the group. My book is, it seriously and systematically considers the group's journalistic writings. And so the chapter's argument is basically that the group had a coherent political vision for what a future post-colonial Vietnam would look like. The group's goal was that they wanted Vietnam to ultimately end up a democratic republic, founded on Republican ideals. They never actually said how they said that this was going to be somehow in the future, And so to get there, Vietnamese were to be guided by the politics of the center-left. Now, the group actually did not, at this moment, advocate violent revolution or anti-colonial struggle to get there. And this is actually the most perplexing aspect of the group's political project. And actually, Marxist scholars will pick up on this aspect as to be their main source of criticism of the group's political agenda. Instead, they advocated a kind of gradualist approach to decolonization. And so I'll go into a little bit more detail about that in my talk. So basically what I want to do for the remainder of my talk is to focus on sort of two sections of the group's political agenda. The first part is I'm going to talk about the group's colonial republicanism. And I will pay particular attention to their demands for institutional reform and their anti-monarchical sentiments. And then I will move on to the group's center-left tendencies and their moderate leftist leanings, and examine how the group's, for example, their sympathies with the French Socialist Party, the SFIO, and their views on economics and labor basically underscores a belief that the state has a role in ameliorating the inequalities brought by unchecked capitalism. So colonial republicanism first. Not to sort of belabor, definitions of republicanism, even in France, it's an incredibly fraught, debated term, but for the most part has kind of coalesced around 5 core values, and that's popular sovereignty, rationality, universality, patriotism, and a belief in political structures. And of course, these ideas of republicanism were transmitted from France to its various overseas territories, in the case of Vietnam, through the Franco-Vietnamese education system. And indigenous elites across the French Empire has wrestled with these republican ideals, and especially vis-a-vis the realities of their colonial condition. As Peter mentioned, earlier, his, study on Vũ Fulton. This is how Vũ Fulton dealt with, and engaged with these ideas of republicanism in the context of French colonization of Vietnam. I'm doing the same with the Le Van Doan. And in many ways, the Le Van Doan and Vũ Fulton overlapped quite significantly. But then there were also a number of sort of departures from each other as well. Now the group's colonial... I have 2 minutes left. So anyway, what I wanted to do just really quickly is to highlight the fact that the group, covered, illustrated their belief in popular sovereignty through their coverage of the Tonkinese Chamber of Representatives. This is, their belief in political structures. They demanded reforms from the French, mainly that France expanded the power of the chamber as well as to expand suffrage of the chamber. They also rejected monarchy, which was basically illustrates their belief that Vietnam needed to be an autonomous, modern, democratic republic. And in this case, they rejected the project of Pham Nguyen to return Tonkin to the Hue court, and to instead they said, throw out the treaty of the Paternoster Treaty. We will re-sign a new treaty with France, allowing Vietnam to become move forward in the future, as opposed to a retrograde move back to the monarchy. Quick about the group's center-left ideas. They actually, most importantly, I think, the most kind of sexiest bit of this chapter, I think, is the fact that the group actually espoused a Marxist-influenced framework for analyzing history and labor. Pham Dao wrote a fantastic kind of series of essays in which he basically follows, almost to the letter, Marx's development of history through feudalism, and then he stops actually at capitalism, where he departs completely from Marx and his disciples, and says that actually right here at this capitalist stage of development, we need to have a state, a moderated relationship between the state, capital, and labor. And this actually is where I think is really important that for Huang Dao, he actually adopts a historical materialist way of looking at labor and capital and development. And he says that actually economics is what moves history, and that it is economics that dictates social structures. And with this in mind, the group's entire literary writings that fought against the oppression of the family now becomes an economic and political argument. Because for the group, family is not just a social structure, it's a political and economic structure. And so, in this case, politics and culture is not separated. They are not even one and the same. In fact, the group's literary writings are subsumed under a larger nationalist agenda that they actually launch later on in the popular front. Sorry, I'm going to one more thing, and then I'm going to conclude really quickly. So thank you. So basically, to conclude, the self-reliant literary group believed that Vietnam should be a democratic republic in the future, but did not advocate violent revolution to do so, because they believed that Vietnam had not yet sufficiently reached the level of economic or social development for it. This also explains the group's, rather lackadaisical attitude towards communism. Vietnam has not reached the stage of economic development where communism is even viable. Basically, Vietnam has not even industrialized. How could we talk about communism in an orthodox sense if we haven't even had, an industrial revolution? So instead, the Gwen Lynn, the group, advocated a revolution of a different kind. A revolution in which Vietnamese built their own civil society from nothing. Right? So we're talking about revolution as the destruction of an old order and the recreation of a new order. In many ways, the building of civil society through Republican ideals is, in many ways, a revolution in its own right. Thank you.
Okay, please don't hate me that I rushed Martina. It's only because we have two other great presentations, and now I would like to introduce Gwen Lynn Hi Coy, from the University of Education, Ho Chi Minh City, and he was educated in Japan, and he's now a fellow here at the University of Oregon. He will talk about Chan Chom Kim and the construction of Vietnamese national soul. So.
Thank you so much for your introduction. The Chom Kim Vietnam Sử Lược, a brief history of Vietnam, is the first modern textbook of Vietnamese history used widely in schools during the colonial period, and from the 1954 to 1975 in the Republic of Vietnam. This work plays an important role in creating the historical understanding and a national consciousness among the Vietnamese people since the early 20th century. In this presentation, I examine the brief history of Vietnam Sử Lược in the intellectual context of Vietnamese social evolutionism in the early 20th century, analyzing its evolutionary nationalism, including the purpose of historiography, the construction of national soul, linguistic nationalism, and the model of the 19th century. In its content, we compare the textbook with those of the communist historiography in the North from the 1950 decades to show how the textbook Vietnam Sử Lược had promoted nationalism in the first half of the 20th century, creating different identities in the North and the South during the Vietnam War. Why Chan Chom Kim? How did Vietnam transform from a colony to an independent country in 1945? Scholars on Vietnam today write history by relying largely on a grand narrative mostly created by Vietnamese communist historians. Thus, grand narrative presents a simplified linear pathway of history, with historical actors being categorized through the lens of communist doctrine. The narrative reads as follows. The Vietnamese people had a patriotic tradition of fighting foreign invaders. The colony eras were marked by Vietnamese heroes who revolt against French rule, while many other groups tried and failed the communist war and ultimately brought about the country's independence in 1945. This grand narrative selectively excludes facts that do not suit their political purposes, presents a fragmentary and partial historical record, and completely omit the political dynamics and alternative political ideology at the time. And the two main communist historians built that model I mentioned about is Trần Văn Dầu and Trần Huy Liệu from the 1915th decade in the North, when the North took over power, the communists took over the power in the North. Recent studies have pointed out that the limitation of such a grand narrative, however, there is still a big gap in evaluating the grand narrative from a historical perspective. In this presentation shift to verify differences in perception of nation and national history and visions about the nation's future by the two groups of people, two groups of Vietnamese, those who were not communist and those who were. I am also interested in question of how their different understanding of nation history influence each group political choice. In order to answer the question, I examined the book Vietnam Sử Lược, Brief History of Vietnam, the first model account of Vietnamese history published in the 1920s by Trần Trọng Kim. This work also presents an alternative interpretation of Vietnam history in the 19th century, including the threat, the choice facing Vietnam, and the cause of key events. A study on the history of Vietnam War often suggests that on the communist Vietnamese side, the nationalism or patriotism was the main driving force. Recently, several studies show that communism plays an important role in determining the fate of Vietnam. Just like other communist countries, Vietnamese communist leaders also utilize the nationalism to take and keep power. However, the question is, what is the origin of Vietnam's nationalism in the early 20th century? More specifically, from what base that the communists made their communist nationalism? However, I challenge the grand narrative of Vietnamese nationalism, which support the notion that Vietnamese communists inherited the century-long tradition of nationalism. I claim that nationalism, patriotism, or awareness of a unified fate of community in Vietnam were born and raised in the early 20th century by the generation of scholars, of which Trần Trọng Kim was one of the prominent figures. Trần Trọng Kim was the first modern historian, the first writer of history of Vietnamese thought, the first author of Vietnamese textbook. Most research related to him focus on his role as the Prime Minister of the Empire of Vietnam in 1945, and overlooking his important role as a scholar and the fact that he was chosen to be Prime Minister because of his scholarly reputation. Vietnam Sử Lược was the first modern textbook Vietnamese history and written in Vietnamese alphabet during the crucial transformative periods of social and spiritual condition of country. The work laid out the solid foundation to understand the history of Vietnam in the first half of 20th century, before the establishment of communist control. This book was not written in a canonical style of king and dynasty, like pre-modern historians have done. Instead, explain the causal relationship of historical phenomena from the three aspects: cultural, society, and politics. The work was influenced by social evolutionism, a concept that was introduced to Vietnam in the pages of the Đông Kinh Nghĩa Thục, the free school of Hanoi in 1908. This book was considered to have had a great influence on the intellectual life of Vietnamese people before 1954 and in the South from the 1954 to 1975. Many scholars at that time, for example, the critic, literary critic Hiếu Sơn in 1951, Vũ Ngọc Phan in his famous series book Nhà văn hiện đại, the modern writer. And in the South, Phạm Thế Vũ in Văn học Việt Nam Giả nước Tân Biên also highly valued his book. In 1922, Chinese historian Lai Kelai translated the book to Chinese, and he quote Chen Xinghe, Taiwanese historian, highly valued this book that based on positivity and scientific method, in addition to politics and campaigns of dynasties, and the book analyzed the system of Mandarin's agricultural system, academic system, and added more short comments on its problem for the listener reference. In short, this book takes an objective standpoint and historical fact that can be trusted. As the earliest Vietnamese historical book written in the Vietnamese language, this has an epoch-making significance in Vietnamese historiography. During the Vietnam War, 1955-1975, this book was used as a historical textbook in the South Vietnam High School. So the book and Trần Trọng Kim ideas of nation contributed largely to the creation of the South's national spiritual identity, which was sharply different from the North's communist nationalism. As soon as the communists took over the North in 1954 and the whole country in the 1975, Vietnam Sử Lược was banned. Communist scholars harshly criticized the book for decades. The first attack took place in 1955 by communist historian Trần Huy Liệu and followed by Văn Tạm, the director of Institute of Historical Studies. They consider this book as a feudal and bourgeois viewed and colonial viewed and even counter-revolutionary historical viewed or something like that. The communist historian neglects the changing perception of the nation in Vietnamese history when being referred to. These concepts only consider secondary or peripheral elements besides the main historical flow of the struggle for independence, in which the feudal and bourgeois patriotic forces failed one after another, and until the Nguyễn Ái Quốc, Hồ Chí Minh, and the Communist Party found the way of proletarian revolution. In the communist historian grand narrative, Vietnamese had a sense of nationalism since the I pass away that. I want to introduce the Vietnam Sử Lược view of history and historiography. Vietnam Sử Lược introduced a lot of Western concepts that had not appeared in Chinese and Vietnamese texts until the late 19th century, such as tiến hóa, evolution, quốc hồn, national soul, chính trị, politics, chính thể, polity, lịch sử, history, quốc gia, dân tộc, ethnic nation, quốc ngữ, national language, nhân dân, people, tư tưởng, ideology, lòng yêu nước, patriotism, cạnh tranh, competition, văn minh, civilization, kỹ thuật, technology, giáo dục, education, and so on. And these terms were created by Japanese when they translating and introducing Western civilization in the Meiji era. They later traveled to China and then to Vietnam in the early 20th century. To fully appreciate the meanings of the concept that form Trần Trọng Kim ideas of history and nation, we need to put them in a Vietnamese intellectual context in the early 20th century. From the text of Free School of Hà Nội, Đông Kinh Nghĩa Thục and Nam Phong tạp chí, the Southern Green magazine. Among these concepts, the concept of tiến hóa, evolution, is the key one, which determines how the author explains the concept, other concept, his view of history, and thus orienting his historical writing. The idea of evolution distinguishes the book from pre-modern historic work and the historiography of the communist historians from the mid-20th century onward. For Trần Trọng Kim, the purpose of historiography is building a national soul. He claimed that the purpose of writing Vietnam Sử Lược was to help the youth today to know something about the country history, so not to save our national soul. And in his understanding, the shame our national soul mean national spirit is weak or ever existed. It means Vietnamese people understood their national history and would have a strong national soul, including nationalism and patriotism. But for him, until his time, the history record was merely a history of dynasty and king, not a history of the nation. So he called this national spirit, called this the shame of national soul. Yes. The term national soul can be traced back to Đông Kinh Nghĩa Thục textbook, Văn Minh Tân Học Sách, a Chinese textbook, namely the plan to build a new education to be civilized. In this context, the term national soul can be interpreted as the characteristic and spirit of the nation, and this concept is developed more clearly by Nguyễn Bá Trác and Phạm Quỳnh, the two main editor of the Nam Phong tạp chí. In the usage of national soul, quốc hồn in the authors was such more broadly than concept of nationalism. In Vietnam Sử Lược, Trần Trọng Kim considers the objects of historical studies the level of national evolution, and he divided Vietnamese history into 5 epochs. His criteria of modeling Vietnamese historical periods were clearly the evolutionary level of the ability and the ability of responding to challenge from the outside. And also in this book, he expressed his national soul, his linguistic nationalism in historiography. And for Trần Trọng Kim, most Vietnamese thinkers in early 20th century realized that contemporary Vietnam national soul was impoverished, and the sense of nationalism would not have been awakened, but they were different in how explain the cause of that. Most of them focus on real geographical track, the feudal ideology of Sino-centralism, education, and race. Trần Trọng Kim shed light on the new cause to which he devoted himself to resolve. That's the lack of major national writing language, and that's why he intentionally chose the book Vietnam Sử Lược in Vietnamese alphabet, and I call his belief linguistic nationalism. Just 1 minute, please. In Vietnam Sử Lược, he also discussed about the problem of evolution of the country, the capacity of creativity of Vietnam in the history and the geographical chapter. Because I have no time, so I pass this. And I please give me 1 minute to summarize the last content. That's in in Vietnam sử lược, Trần Trọng Kim construct the models of the 19th century of Vietnam as the periods Vietnam faced the two civilizations, China and France, and Vietnam failed. That's totally different from the communist model of the 19th century, in which there's only the two actors, the French invader and Vietnamese people as a victim, and the model of 19th century determined the understanding of 20th century and determined the political choice of many of two main social political forces of republicanism and communism. And then I argue that Trần Trọng Kim models also influenced the contemporary nowadays Vietnamese society nowadays. Just because I have no time now, so can we discuss more in later?
Yeah, the paper is long and it has been circulated, before among the participants. So if you have access to it, if you like to read it, Lynn, please come over.
So, yeah. So now we have our last presentation on our panel, and I know there will be other people who follow being me here, and it's a terrible job to interrupt. I have 5 minutes, 2 minutes, 1 minute, and really the end. So it's only because the conference is such a success, and there are so many of us who are going to present, and we have so little time. So the last presentation on our panel is actually a paper that is co-authored by Hoang Phong Tuan and Gwen Lynn, both from the University of Education in Ho Chi Minh City. They both work on different aspects of representation in literature and in film, and on the different aspects of memory. And today they are presenting. Actually, Min is presenting on behalf of both of them on creative freedom as the identity of a national literature, the contributions of arts and literature magazines to the literature of the First Republic.
Firstly, I would like to thank Dr. Tu Vũ for his valuable encouragement and suggestions for our paper. This is a collaborative paper by me and my colleague in the Ho Chi Minh City University of Education. And the creative freedom as the identity of a national literature, the contributions of arts and literature magazines to literature of the First Republic. And I'd like to start our presentation by quoting some verses like this, so you can have a feeling of how strongly it was that the writers of this period believed about the freedom they had. So shall I read it in Vietnamese? I think if you can read it in Vietnamese, the feeling even stronger. My voice is not strong enough. I'm sorry about that. Mở toang cửa sổ tự do, thôi ngột ngạt kín bưng, tháo xiềng đập ngục đổ gục, chiến thắng giọt hương say và say mơ thi sĩ. So why did we come up with this study? Previous research on identity images of this period builds on the world historical views of post-colonial space and the context of the Cold War. Such an approach ignores the imagination and efforts to create a new identity for the national literature by writers and advocates of art and literature who were insiders finding themselves playing a role in building a new culture. So to fill the gap of research on this topic, our research analyzes the process of identity construction through the discourse and works of writers and managing editors in three prominent magazines, namely Văn hóa ngày nay, Bách khoa, and Sáng tạo, during the early stage of the First Republic. And the paper points out that within the art and culture domain, in the early stage from 1956 to 1960, writers and managing editors have attempted to construct the idea of liberal environment and creative freedom as the identity of new national literature and culture through discourse and writing practice. This is our three main points following the path of identity construction. Freedom as a discourse and narrative of identity, the way that the writers and managing editors construct their identity, and innovation and diversity, a perspective on literary history from the identity of freedom. That when after building the identity, it in turn makes contribution for them to visualize about how literary history should be, and challenges and affirmations identity confronting reality. So let's go on to the first section of our paper. So the challenges for people in the new period in the early history of the Republic of Vietnam in searching for the identity was that their imagination about themselves and about the culture they were building had to be culturally distinct and authentic at the same time. But these two aspects had a contradiction. If their imagined new identity was culturally authentic, which meant that their culture was purer and more original than the one from the northern shore, this culture could not have been completely different from the current northern culture. So in this case, the envisioning of the liberal environment became the fulcrum for defining the distinctness and authenticity of the new historical period, and thereby providing a solution to the contradiction. So the new culture was distinctive because it gave people an absolute freedom. Therefore, in their mind, in their will, it was authentic. Freedom was thereby an identity that afforded all their demands. The imagination of creative freedom as the identity of a new culture was related to the formation of Saigon as a new cultural capital by writers and editors of art and literature magazines. So you can see some examples of discourse like that. Like, no longer alive, Saigon is a heart. Cultural materials are still scattered around, but the form of the cultural castle can be seen. This castle, started from the center of Saigon, will be beautiful, will be quintessential, because it's built up according to our aesthetic appeal. It will be healthy and robust, because it is rooted in the health and robustness of a life and a people in democracy and freedom. And you can see some the same discourses in poems like this. You can read in the. Shall I read it? Or Ta ngưỡng vọng hôm nay trời lý tưởng, ngát mùa xanh xanh thắm của yêu thương, rực bình minh rạng rỡ ánh thiên đường, đêm gục chết theo với thời quá khứ. Ta bước tới nắng tương lai đầy ứ, phố lớn cười, đại lộ hát nghi ngang. So in their imagination, you can see that Saigon can be seen as a new space with that's operated by new rules and will bring them the new future. Actually, from a comparative point of view, we see this discourse on a changing center and the construction of a new cultural space with the identity of freedom was not new, but had appeared in 1945 to 1946 when Viet Minh writers envisioned Hanoi as the capital of freedom. However, the idea of freedom there was built on Marxist and Leninist conception of class struggle and national liberation, whereby the first mission was to liberate the people, then liberate the working class from oppressions. It was a condition for freedom. And it's different from the point of view of the people in Saigon later time, as you can see. For the generation of Republican writers and artists in the Republic of Vietnam, freedom was the nature of particular individual, and people should build a cultural space that were consistent with that nature. Therefore, their mission was to build a new cultural space to promote human values. And for them, the social environment in the North, due to the national and proletarian revolution, made people lose their freedom. The second discourse that you can see in this time was the discourse of creative freedom. So what kind of freedom that they imagined about? It was, in their opinion, it has to be like free from the historical time and space and without any boundaries. So in some sense, it's a kind of absolute and ideal freedom. And maybe this is one of the reasons why in later time they will like face a lot of challenges when identity confronting reality. So you can see here the citation by Nhất Linh. Pure art must reach the quintessence and especially must allow temporary and local taste to make art a thing that is only valid for a while or in a particular place. And we can see the idea of creative freedom in the narrative about the artist, like this one. The artist in the finger endowed by God. In Vietnamese, it is những ngón tay bắt được của trời. By Mai Thảo, he used to follow the resistance, but he had in mind the concept of creative freedom. And then he was accused and punished just because he insisted on following his own path of creative freedom. But then after that, in Saigon, he found a freedom to develop his talent in the cultural capital of today. So basically, the liberal environment changed the life of the artist so that he could reveal all his talent. Thus, the above discourses and narrative shows that the liberal environment of the new period was an essential condition for creativity, and creative freedom was a condition for valuable works to be created. The main thing is that such narratives and discourses help shape the identity of the new cultural context and the characteristics of a new literature, promoting writers, artists, and the public to bond together in a common mind and atmosphere, to be able to work together to build a new culture. for migrant writers, and to some extent the writers who always look back to their origins from the north, that identity also helped them to have a strong mind when they had to escape from the northern shores where they must have always felt they belonged. It also eased their pain and trauma in the past, helping them rewrite their lives in a new cultural space. Move on to the next section, innovation and diversity, a perspective on literary history from the identity of freedom. So the conception of liberal environment and the imagination of creative freedom as the identity of a new literature allowed to build them a fulcrum for repositioning literary values and help them to visualize the past and project the future of literature. So that in that sense, they had a vision of how a history of literature should be. So I don't have much time, so maybe I will say something shortly here. So for them, what the history of literature should be. The first thing is that's the history of innovation, in which artistic values transcend taste of the times and temporary constraints of non-artistic things. And that's the constant process of sublation. Sublation is the translated term from Hegel's of heaven, meaning abolish, just at the same time converse and elevate. And that should be the history of diversity. That means that people support the manifold differences in colors and nuances of works of art. This is the quotation from Yedling's statement, muôn màu muôn vẻ lại muôn hương. That's the thing they try to convey. And they called for a variety of views and voices that did not have to come from the same religion, from the same political views, or from a single cohesive organization. That's the reason why they welcome the presence of the different voices and a variety of experiments by writers and artists. And the result was that they opened up an early stage of literature that was diverse, innovative, and explorative. And many poets and writers with different, even opposite style appear in turn. And the most important thing was that they built an identity and therefore brought a historical perspective to the new literature. However, over time, there emerged doubts and criticism about their writing practice and literary innovations, while questioning their argument that the liberal environment of the new era was a condition for works of high value. So there were criticism on innovation. It's immoral, corrupt, unethical, ruthless, foreign, and revolting. And regarding diversity, someone thought that it made artists had no base to develop and position themselves. Especially a very big stride on the identity that they had constructed before was that some criticism showed how helpless the artists in the liberal environment were in expressing the consciousness of their own time. Faced with some of these criticisms, so such critical judgments made Maitao and some others realize that their earlier imagination of liberal art, going beyond the concept of reality, needed some adjustment. In general, they still insisted on the value and prospects of a literature built on the identity of creative freedom. As you can see here, art is a free forum. Freedom is the first and eternal criterion of art. Some of our conclusions and suggestions. So the contributions of an idea of creative freedom in the three magazines, they built up their identity and projected the vision of a new literary history. and facilitated the diverse forms and creative innovations of literature. We suggested some kind of internal point of view that you look into a subject from, insider's view. And that's our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much to the presenters, and now I'm happy to open the floor for questions. Yes, Zoe.
Question for Martina. Yes, my question is for Martina and for Gwen Lynn Hi Coy. So both of you sort of frame your papers as critiques of the teleology or the grand narrative that the Communist Party has put forth about it being sort of the authentic realization of Vietnamese nationalism and sort of the only effective sort of political response to colonialism. But I'm wondering to what degree that your critiques of this teleology end up sort of perpetuating other forms of teleology, right? So, for example, in Lung Hi Coy's paper, it seems as if it doesn't call into question the teleology of the nation itself and this ahistorical concept of Vietnamese history as being this story about this unified Vietnamese national subject through 2,000 years, right? And then in the case of Martina's paper, I'm wondering if there's sort of an equally ahistorical conception of progress, right, that underlies this sort of republicanism, where you have this sort of standard kind of teleological Enlightenment view of modern history going from superstition and despotism into freedom with the establishment of modern constitutional states. So I guess my question is, are some teleologies okay as long as they're non-communist?
So in the case of the Van Duan, in a certain sense, for these guys, it's not necessarily teleological if it hasn't actually happened in a sense. So they had this sort of envisioning of Vietnam as eventually a future democratic republic, and they had this kind of step-by-step method to get there. But at the same time, there was also a lot of open-endedness in this process. There was sort of contingency that was built in. And this is actually why, the group never really championed violent revolution, right? They said, look, we could seize political power now, but we're not ready for it, and it's going to lead to despotism, and it's going to lead to demagoguery. And so for them, I guess is there a teleology? I think of it more as an open-ended plan. Because these guys said, look, we got to build this civil society, and then at some point in the future, we are going to be ready for autonomy. And in that moment, that's when we're going to decide about our relationship with the empire, right, with France. We are at that moment when we're ready for autonomy. Then, do we go into a federation with France, or do we completely kick out France altogether? But it has to get to the moment where we're ready for it. So it's less of a kind, I would say, a kind of like prescriptive revolutionary plan, like the kind that's advocated by the Marxists. It's a much more open-ended kind of, it's a plan of action, surely, but it's much more open-ended and allowed for a lot more contingency. I don't know if that adequately addresses your point, but yeah.
I want to add it more views, more perspective by compare the views of Trần Huy Liệu and Trần Trọng Kim on the 19th century, because the differences between the Republican nationalism and communist nationalism is determined by how they view the Vietnamese 19th century. In the communist nationalism, the 19th century just the era that Vietnam invaded by the French. And in that era, France is invader, and Vietnam is a victim, and the Nguyen dynasty is betrayer, and the collaborator with the friends, and the people is bravely fight to the friend, but they failed until the Communist Party appeared and won and brought the independence to the country. In that model, they ignore many true historical fact. For example, they ignore the Sino-French War. You know, in the nowadays Vietnamese historical textbook, to teaching students, they ignore the Sino-French War in the 19th century, and the students do not know that. But in Republican nationalism, they viewed the 19th century as the era that Vietnam faced the two civilizations, the outdated China and the modernized France. At that time, in the 19th century, when the French conquered the Nam Kỳ, the south, in the north, the Chinese Qing dynasty also invaded the north. And the French and the Chinese Qing dynasty fight each other to control Vietnam. And so at that time, according to Trần Trọng Kim, the only correct choice of Vietnam is that modernize themselves, modernize the country to become a strong country and can be independent like Japan. But as Trần Trọng Kim analyzed in Vietnam Sử Lược, at that time in Vietnam there is no political and social forces can do that. So Vietnam only have two choices. One, it become a Chinese vassal, and the second, it become the French colony. The Nguyen dynasty have no choice. Yeah.
Thank you so much. There are more questions. Could you please identify yourself just by name or affiliation if you have when you ask a question? We have 9.5 minutes left, so we still have time.
I've got the mic. quick question for Hoy and Bun and Ming. I really enjoyed both of your papers. And I noticed that all three of you work at the University of Education in Ho Chi Minh City. And so I'm curious, how would you describe the state of scholarship in Vietnam today about the cultural and intellectual history of the Republic of Vietnam?
You know, in Vietnam, the scholar working on Vietnamese literature, Vietnamese history, Vietnamese history of thought, Vietnamese art, still relied on the model, the communist model of modern history, in order to write Vietnamese history of Vietnamese literary, social thought history. So the model, the republicanism is not a scientific academic object in Vietnam now. That's in Vietnam. For many decades, the republicanism is considered as a secondary issue, because the main flows, historical flows, that's the struggle for independence. So in the struggle for independence, the communism is the main factor. So if you read the textbook of literary history, history of thought, or social history, or something like that, you will in Vietnam you will see that the history of communism is dominated. So yes.
Okay, so talking about the state of intellectual in Vietnam, about the Republic of Vietnam. As far as I am concerned, I think in Vietnam nowadays the atmosphere of studying kind of very open. Yeah, we can see some evidence, there's a lot of works of art of Republican Vietnam writers, for example, some novels by Dương Nghĩa Mậu and lịch sử báo chí Việt Nam Cộng Hòa, and some other works like that. They now they can print and read openly in Vietnam. So I kind of have a very optimistic view about that atmosphere of intellectual and the environment, academic environment in Vietnam, I think.
I want to add it that when the books reprint in Vietnam now, they was labeled as the văn học yêu nước đô thị Việt Nam. It means the Southern patriotic literature. Without this label, it's very hard to reprint.
My name is Lê Nguyễn. I'm from The Voice America. I have two questions to Mr. Gwen Lynn Hi Coy. You mentioned that the Vietnam Sử Lược was used in the Republic of Vietnam as a textbook. So I'm wondering how did it contribute to shaping the Republic of Vietnam at its worst, especially in contrast to the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in the north. And the second question is, during the life of Trần Trọng Kim, he's in the early 20th century, he witnessed the rise of communism, of Marxism, as a very important force and theory that that can help liberate the country. So how was his views of communism, of Marxism, during his political and academic life? Thank you.
For the first question, in short, I think the main differences of historical perspective expresses in Vietnam Sử Lược is that they viewed the Vietnamese history as in an evolutionary perspective. So, while in the north, they consider the history of Vietnam is the history of struggle, class struggle, and the struggle for independence. If reading the historical textbook in the north, we feel that the history of Vietnamese is just the history of fighting with foreign invader, and we do nothing excepting fighting. The historian Chí Đại Trường said that the North historiography is sử học tranh đấu. It means the historiography for fighting. But in Vietnam Sử Lược, the history of Vietnam is not only the history of fighting with invaders. That's the history of cultural, history of social, history of politics, and more importantly, especially that's the history of evolution of the people. The second question, you asked about how Trần Trọng Kim feels on communism. In Vietnam Sử Lược, there is no mention about communism because at that time, the communism have not come to Vietnam yet. But in Một cơn gió bụi, his autobiography, he's expressed his view on communism deeply. Yeah, and his Một cơn gió bụi, he's considered communists as political forces that lack the nationalism, but so have strong communism. So they have they put their ideology, communist ideology, over the nation. That's his view.
Thank you. Next question, please.
I have a microphone. I also have a question, or maybe a suggestion from Gwen Lynn Hi Coy. It's been over 10 years since I've read Dong Kim's book, but I was wondering if you could maybe tie it more closely to talk about the effect on the Republic of Vietnam, if you could compare his work to historians who published under the RVN and the actual secondary school textbooks that students read. My impression is that that book was used maybe by teachers, but students doing assignments would have read books that were a little simpler. And in particular, my sense is that that book helped popularize terms like 4,000 years of history, or terms like Trần Nguyễn Phong Trần as the name for that time period, or the approach in the RVN of teaching history king by king by king, because there are many textbooks like that that seem to be modeled after Dong Kim. So this is just a suggestion.
I'm sorry, I don't understand clearly the main point in the question. Can you repeat again? I'm sorry. Yeah, can you summarize the question?
So what I mean is that
Yeah.
Dong Kim is important also as an influence on historians in the Republic of Vietnam who published their own books.
Yeah.
And it would be interesting to see the relationship
Yeah.
in between Dong Kim and his successors.
Yeah.
And it would also be interesting to look at textbooks that were used by students in secondary school and how they compared to Dong Kim's book, because my understanding is that it was probably teachers who used Dong Kim's book more than secondary school students in their everyday classes.
Yes. I think in the history, Vietnam have some historiography from Lê Văn Hưu, Ngô Sĩ Liên, and Lê Quý Đôn, or someone like that. And as you point out, they just write a chronicle style of the dynasty and kings. But Trần Trọng Kim analyzed the political, cultural, and social evolutionary history of Vietnam. And I think maybe you asked about the historical education in secondary school in the north, in the south. I don't know about the real education. How in the south, how the teacher at that time teach the textbook. But I think that's so totally different from the historical education in the south at that time to the north and the whole Vietnam nowadays. Because after I mentioned about that in a communist model, a history of Vietnam just a history of fighting, and but the history of that's Vietnam sử lược depicted. That's the history of evolution, a social, political, and national evolution. So, just I hope that makes sense. Yeah.
Thank you. We have several questions. Alex Kai will collect them because we have only 2 minutes left, and 2.5. And then they will the participants will respond. So Alex Kai will collect all the questions.
Yes, thank you. I'm Sean Fear from University of Leeds, and my question's for Martina. I was really struck in the paper just how left-wing some of the ideas that the intellectuals you look at are. They envision a very robust welfare state. They really support labor unions, for example. And I guess I was just wondering, to what extent do they envision a future mass politics in Vietnam? Do they have a sense that at some point everyday people will become politically attuned and engaged? Or is it always much more of a sort of educational, intellectual, elite-driven type of politics.
We're collecting questions.
Yeah,
Oh, sorry.
my question is for Martina too. I don't know if my question is the same, but it's the first time I heard about the Van Duan advocated to the center left. And in your point of view, the actual Vietnam, the real Vietnam now is a center left, extreme left, or even on the right.
Hi, my name is Vinh Tư. I come from California. I wonder that if you know that about 2 or 3 years ago in Vietnam, the measure of history almost abandoned.
This is a question for Chuan and Ming. You mentioned Hegel very briefly, and I know that this is a period when I believe that a lot of philosophical texts are being translated into Vietnamese, probably for the first time. In the 30s, you really had to read French to read sort of Western philosophers through French translation. And I'm just wondering if you had really, I'm afraid I didn't read your paper, but I wonder if you have explored the kind of tendacious relationship between the kind of philosophical ideas of freedom that come through Western texts and how that can become the basis of a kind of radical Vietnamese nationalist freedom.
Okay. I am really glad, Sean, you raised this. This is actually what the thrust of the part 2 of my book is about, is that, you know, and the historiography of the group up until now has emphasized that this is a cultural reform, this is social reform, you know, and of course Western scholarship repeats a lot of this. This was patriarchal, it was a bunch of elites that were, you know, condescending to the masses, you know, and this very kind of, this is a Cold War inherited narrative that we're looking at here. And actually what I want to emphasize, you know, is that this was an actual plan to get Vietnamese politically involved. You know, the group envisioned their literature, their newspapers to, first of all, reading their newspapers, reading their literature, people reading them, it's about developing a kind of political subjectivity, right? An idea that, you know, that they start to envision themselves as part of this Vietnamese nation, or you know, or this Vietnamese identity. Later on in the sort of Popular Front movement, in the Popular Front period, this is when the group starts to mobilize these, you know, populations that they have, you know, cultivated towards political action. And so, you know, and this is where I think the Đoàn Sang, the League of Light, is basically the group's culmination of these ideas. And, you know, it's you know, and this is also why Khai Hung was particularly interested in the SFIO as a party, because, you know, this is basically a party where Vietnamese can learn how to how to politically participate in formal politics. And so for them, it's not just about education, but it's about kind of, you know, inculcating habits that will be the foundation of a civil society for the future. So second, you know, to address the second question, and what is Vietnam now? Well, I think in many ways that, you know, Vietnam has always had this kind of Republican, you know, progressive, you know, strain kind of, you know, beginning in the colonial period through, you know, it's sort of simmered up at sort of various, you know, at various times. You know, whether or not it's, you know, right or left or, you know, but I think that Republican tendencies and the Republican sensibilities that are, you know, that the Van Duan clearly illustrate have always been there. And, you know, this is also why Peter was talking about the sort of resurgence of interest in these ideas, because these ideas are simmering, don't really go away. I'm told this is really the end.
You will have a lot of time during those 2 days
Yeah. So the artists and writers of this time, there's a lot of people that study from the Western countries, especially from French, and they use a lot of like philosophical term in their writing, and in our presentation I mentioned the terminology sublation by Hegel, and Mai used it on purpose to talk about what the history of literature should be. It should be like a sublate. That means in Hegel idea that there's nothing totally new, but we have to get out of ourselves to continue to move on to to go forward, and that's his idea.
Thank you so much.